Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out in the Kursk direction where the Ukrainian Kursk offensive is ongoing. However, the Russians are trying to gain the initiative and are started to launch counterattacks. From Korenevo towards the agglomeration by Lyubimovka, the Russians have started a counterattack where they've managed to regain about 10 square kilometers as they start moving towards the Ukrainian positions. The Ukrainians had previously attempted to attack in the direction of Korenevo, however those attacks failed as the Russian presence there was strong enough to withstand the Ukrainian offensive operation, and since then the Russians and the Ukrainians have been clashing in the area between Korenevo and Lyubimovka, and now the Russians have managed to win these clashes and are starting to push in the direction of Lyubimovka and the surrounding villages. At the same time, a currently ongoing battle is won here by Malaya Luknia, where following the Ukrainian capture of the first villages along the river line, the Russians have started a counterattack along this position where they're trying to push down south to regain the connection by the railways to fully regain control over that line of defense that spans from the river line and towards the eastern parts of Sutsha, and also to regain the road between the Russian positions and Sutsha to have additional supply roads going in and out of the town. The Russians are currently stuck with only the northeastern and southeastern roads, with the northwestern road being under Ukrainian control here in this section. So we see that the Russians are currently fighting over that, and at the same time they're also fighting from the Sutsha direction to connect with the fighting in the north, where they're looking to regain full control over the railways, prevent the Ukrainians from establishing positions on the eastern part of it, and establish the front line there. In my previous video, I said the number one priority of the Russian army was to establish a front line, and that is currently happening. The Russians are fighting southeast of Korenevo, establishing a front line there. The front line has been established in the west, where the Ukrainians have not advanced too much. And then in the northern parts and eastern parts along the railway line is another place where the Russians are fighting to establish a front line along it. So they have to fight and push the Ukrainians back before they achieve a front line along the railways, after which the Russians will start pushing in Sutsha to regain full control over the town, and then they will start to push to gain control over the fortified positions. Here's a map from Rybar about the movement of troops. We can see that moving from Kursk, there are three separate directions the Russians are moving in. They're moving towards the west, where they are going to support Korenevo. They are moving through the northern road through Malaya Luknia, where their fighting is taking place. And then there's the third road, which goes through towards Sutsha. In the northwestern road in the direction of Korenevo, we have this massive strike which took place somewhere here in the road from Kursk towards Rilsk. The Russian army was sending a lot of units to deal with this Ukrainian offensive, and in that movement they were moving in a column, which is the safest way to move when there are opposing forces moving within your territory and you do not have a clear overview over where the Ukrainians are present. If they were moving all the way up, then being in a column will allow them to deal with such an operation. If they split around and about, they would be ambushed by small forces and they would be hit while isolated. However, the issue is, and the mistake the Russians made here, was that they stood still. Standing still is a terrible thing to do 20 kilometers from the front line, especially when you're a large convoy. We see this video here from Ukrainian sources showing a GMLRS strike on the Russian column. This Russian column was multiple trucks filled with infantry, and as soon as the first rocket hits, all of the trucks start driving, the ones with the driver, the rest, the infantry start evacuating the vehicles. However, 13 vehicles ended up being hit, some were filled, some were not. In the end, according to my sources, 80 Russian soldiers were 200 and 50 Russian soldiers were 300. Following the strike, this video here came out showing the Russian soldier driving by as he looks at the ruins of the strike, showing the aftermath. Some trucks were flipped over, some were burnt out to a crisp, some still had Russian 200s sticking out, and it was a terrible sight from this strike. And this shows exactly the danger and the terrible consequences of such mistakes 30 months into the conflict, which shows that some people really shouldn't be trusted with soldiers in their care. This third and final video shows a battle between Ukrainian vehicles and Russian ATGM as well as drones from a long distance, hitting the Ukrainian vehicles from a long distance. We see that the Ukrainians have sent a lot of forces into the Kursk region. According to the latest reports, it is 6,000 soldiers from 3 different brigades. According to the latest information, the current size of fully equipped Ukrainian brigades are just about 2,000 soldiers fighting at the front line. Therefore, we see 3 entire brigades have been sent into the Kursk region, and now that is not enough, as the Russians are now in a position where they've started to counterattack and retake positions here in the Kursk region. We will now see if the Russians will be able to turn this offensive around and recapture the positions in the Kursk region. We've seen a lot of videos of Russian convoys and columns being sent to the front line. Some were hit, as we saw with the footage up north, and some have arrived unscathed to the front, where they have started fighting with the Ukrainian soldiers. If the front line is established, we'll not be seeing any more Ukrainian breakthroughs with the capture large heaps of territory. We'll instead see positional fighting, as the Russians and the Ukrainians will each attempt to advance on their own. Currently, the most reports point towards the Russians regaining ground and the Ukrainians digging in, giving up on the idea of further territorial captures. It seems that if the Ukrainians right now goes directly to defense and starts to have their main objective simply to slow down the Russians from regaining control of the Kursk region, then it is completely clear that this is a preemptive strike and the objective is to slow down the Russian objective and offensive and to hit these convoys while they are moving with the reconnaissance drones and in work together with the MLRS systems such as HIMARS. Hitting the Russian columns such as that one is one of the goals in such a scenario where the Russians were forced to rapidly deploy to stabilize the front, and that is exactly where they are most vulnerable. The same thing happened when the Ukrainians were sending a lot of forces to deal with the Kharkiv offensive of the Russians. They were hit on the move, both with air defense systems and columns were hit while they were moving towards Vovchansk and Lipsy to counterattack and regain positions. And the same has now happened on the Russians, where they were hit on the move. But now that the Russians have established their positions, it will turn into a Kharkiv-like scenario again, where the Russians will likely be able to stabilize the front and then attempt to push back, while the Ukrainians will dig in and try to hold back the Russians for as much as possible. But what is clear right now is that the Russians have started their counterattack. There are a few updates in the south as well. In the direction of Rosdelivka, the Russians are now moving towards Perishne, where they've managed to gain a foothold in the southern parts of it, and in the direction of Fedorivka as well. This fighting signals the full capture and consolidation of Rosdelivka, and now fighting is moving in the direction of Perishne, which actually flanks the Ukrainian positions in Fedorivka and may allow the Russians to pincer Fedorivka from the north and from the south in an assault from Sekoye-Vantsety. However, it is unclear whether the Russians will launch any offensive operations here from the south, crossing over the river, as the Ukrainians still have positions by Vasyukivka, west of Sekoye-Vantsety, which means that if the Russians are to move towards Fedorivka, they can flank them from the rear. However, this could also signal a start of a Russian operations in the direction of Vasyukivka as well, especially if the Russians continue operations by Selesnyansk, both in the eastern directions towards Vasyukivka and further north along the fields here in the area. So we see that the Russian operations have now entered Perishne and fighting is commenced in the southern parts of the village. In the Pokrovsk section of the front line, the Russians have advanced here west of Novoalexandrivka, where the operations are now starting in the direction of Vostyshenka, where the Russian objective is following the capture of Timofivka and Lysychyna to start operations in the direction of Vostyshenka towards the intersection between Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka, where the Russians are launching offensive operations both in that direction as well as in the direction of Pokrovsk itself. The Ukrainians are stretched thinly in this section of the front line, which has allowed the Russians to constantly advance in the section of the front line, and the Ukrainian defensive positions are falling one after another. This exact issue is what is sending the most criticism towards the Ukrainian Kursk offensive, although it is a well-executed offensive which has learned both from its own summer offensive, from the Russian subsequent offensive, and the Russian Kharkiv offensive, has learned from all those three and made the most effective use of the units they had in that section of the front line. It is still a mistake and failure if they did not really achieve much of a goal, simply redirect forces from the Kharkiv direction towards the Kursk direction, and the Russians just continue advancing in the Pokrovsk, Chasiv Yar, and Toretsk sections of the front line to then gain control over the Donetsk region, while slowly regaining control over the Kursk region would end up as a failure on the Ukrainian part, although the tactical advantages and situational success has happened, the strategic success simply is not there. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.